The first frost of October had already silvered the pines above Willow Creek when Edith Turner stepped out into her yard and found her kiln stone cold, and something inside her chest went cold along with it, because that kiln was the last thing her husband John had built with his own 2 hands before the fever took him 8 months before. She stood there in her apron with flour still dusting her wrists from the morning bread, staring at the squat brick dome that had failed her 3 nights running now. The fire she had banked so carefully before bed had gone out again, and inside sat 24 bowls and plates she had promised to the mercantile in town, unfired, worthless clay that would crumble to dust if she could not get them properly hardened before the buyer from Denver came through at the end of the week. Willow Creek was not much of a town in the year 1873, just a scattering of clapboard buildings strung along a muddy road at the base of the Front Range, with a general store, a livery, a small church, and a scattering of homesteads pushed up against the timberline where the mountains rose steep and dark and full of secrets. Edith had come here with John 3 years back, following the promise of good clay along the creek bed and cheap land. And when the fever swept through the mining camps upstream and carried him off in the space of 4 terrible days, she had stayed on because there was nothing left for her back east, and because the pottery was the only thing she had left that still felt like him. She knelt now beside the kiln and pressed her palm against the cold brick, and a tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it, because it was not just the pots she was losing. It was another piece of proof that she could not do this alone, that a widow with 2 small hands and a broken heart could not keep a kiln burning through a Colorado autumn, no matter how hard she tried. She did not hear the footsteps behind her until a shadow fell across the yard, long and broad-shouldered in the gray morning light, and she startled so badly she nearly toppled into the ash pit. "Didn't mean to frighten you, ma'am," said the man, and his voice was low and rough like river stones, though there was a gentleness folded into it that she had not expected from someone built like a barn door. Edith scrambled to her feet, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart still hammering. The man standing at the edge of her yard was easily the largest human being she had ever seen up close, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin coat and forearms roped with muscle, where he had pushed his sleeves back against the morning chill. His hair was dark and long, tied back loosely at his neck with a leather cord, and a beard, not unkempt but clearly untouched by any barber's scissors in some months, covered a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He carried a rifle slung easy across one shoulder and a hand axe hung from his belt, and behind him, tethered loosely to the fence post, stood a great gray mule loaded with furs and traps. "You're on my land," Edith said, more sharply than she intended because fear made her tongue quick. "I am, and I'm sorry for it," the man said, and he touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, which was battered and wide and had clearly seen every kind of weather the Rockies could throw at a man. "Name's Benjamin Boone. I trap up on the ridge past Elkhorn Pass, come down through here maybe twice a season to trade furs at the mercantile. I was passing by before light and I saw your kiln smoke had stopped rising 2 nights back. Figured something was wrong." Edith blinked at him. "You've been watching my kiln smoke." A faint color rose above his beard, visible even in the dim light. "Didn't mean it's strange, ma'am. I camp up on the ridge trail most nights this time of year, and your fire's about the only light I see for miles when I'm coming down off the mountain. When it goes dark, I notice." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence stretched between them until Benjamin Boone shifted his weight and nodded toward the kiln. "You mind if I take a look? I've built more than my share of hearths and forge fires up in the high camps. Sometimes it's just a flue gone wrong or damp got into the brick." Edith hesitated. She had learned in the 8 months since John died that men who offered help often wanted something in return, whether it was her land or her body or simply the satisfaction of being needed by a woman who could not say no. But there was something in Benjamin Boone's dark eyes, something steady and unhurried, that made the fear in her chest loosen just slightly. "I can't pay you," she said plainly. I've got flour and coffee, and not much else until the Denver buyer comes through." "Didn't ask for pay," Benjamin said, already crouching beside the kiln with an ease that belied his size, running his thick fingers along the seams of the brick with surprising gentleness. "A man doesn't need paying to do a decent thing." He worked in silence for several minutes while Edith stood watching, arms crossed against the cold, and she found herself studying him despite herself. The way his muscles shifted beneath his coat as he reached into the flue and pulled out a fistful of wet ash and rotted kindling. The careful way he examined each brick before setting it back in place. The low hum he made under his breath, some tuneless mountain song that seemed to come from him without his even noticing. "Here's your trouble," he said finally, holding up a chunk of brick that had crumbled at the corner. "This one's cracked clean through. Been letting damp seep into your firebox every time it rains, and once damp gets into a kiln like this, she won't hold heat no matter how much would you feed her." "I don't have another brick," Edith said, and her voice cracked despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "John made these himself, fired them from the same clay pit down by the creek, and I don't know how he did it. I never learned the trick of the mortar." Benjamin looked up at her then, and something in his dark eyes softened. "I can make you a new one before dawn breaks proper. I've got clay of my own knowledge from years of building Ford stones up in the mining camps. Won't be as fine as your husband's work, but it'll hold heat until you can learn the trick yourself, or until you find someone to teach you." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had dropped lower, rougher, like he was admitting something he had not meant to say aloud. "Because I've been alone on that mountain going on 6 years now, ma'am, and I know what it is to watch something you love go cold and not know how to bring the warmth back into it." Edith did not ask what he meant by that. She simply nodded and stepped back and let the mountain man get to work. He worked through the gray hours before dawn with a patience that surprised her, mixing clay from the creek bank with ash and a bit of horsehair he pulled from his own mule's tail, shaping it by lamplight into a rough brick, and setting it near the small cookfire he built beside her cabin to speed the drying. While it hardened, he rebuilt the firebox from the ground up, clearing out the old damp ash, laying fresh kindling in a careful lattice the way she had seen John do 100 times but had never quite mastered herself. And all the while he talked to her in that low, unhurried voice, telling her about the traplines up past Elkhorn Pass, about the winter he'd spent snowed into a lined shack with nothing but salt pork and a Bible with half its pages torn out for kindling, about the wolves that sometimes shadowed his trail through the high country, but had never once given him real trouble. Edith found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the night, despite the cold that bit at her fingers as she held the lamp steady for him, and somewhere in the telling of his stories she realized she had not felt this settled, this quietly safe, in longer than she could remember. "You had a wife once," she said, not quite a question, somewhere near the middle of the night when the new brick had hardened enough to set. Benjamin's hands stilled over the kiln for just a moment. "Had a woman I loved back in Missouri before I ever came west. Sarah was her name. We were to be married in the spring, but the influenza took her the winter before, same as it seemed to take everybody worth loving in those years." He set the brick carefully into place, tamping fresh mortar around its edges with his thumb. "I came out here after, thought the mountains might fill up whatever she left empty. They didn't, not really, but they gave me quiet, and quiet's its own kind of mercy sometimes." Edith felt her throat tight. "I understand that better than most." "I figured you might," Benjamin said, and glanced up at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but held something warm at its edges. "Woman alone out here, running a kiln on her own with no husband to help haul the wood or mind the fire through the night, takes a particular kind of grit, or a particular kind of desperation," Edith said, and this time she did smile faintly, surprising herself. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, streaked with the pale gold that came before true dawn in the high country, the kiln stood rebuilt and the fire roared inside it, hot and steady, the flames licking up through the new brick and old in equal measure. Benjamin loaded the last of the unfired pots into the chamber himself, his enormous hands surprisingly careful with the delicate greenware, setting each bowl and plate with the same gentleness he had shown the clay brick hours before. "She'll hold heat through the day now," he said, straightening and wiping his hands on his buckskin trousers. "Check the flue morning and night, and if that brick ever starts to sweat, you pull it and let it dry by the fire before you set it back." "Thank you," Edith said, and the words felt entirely too small for what he had given her, not just a fixed kiln but a night of not being alone with her grief, a night of feeling like the world still held some kindness in it. "I don't know how I'll repay you." Benjamin considered her for a long moment, and something passed behind his dark eyes that she could not quite read. "You could let me come check on that fire again, next time I'm down off the mountain. Make sure she's holding." "I'd like that," Edith said, and found that she meant it more than she had expected to. He mounted his mule as the first true light broke over the eastern ridge, and Edith stood in her yard watching him go, the great bulk of him swaying easy in the saddle, until he disappeared around the bend where the road curved up toward the timber line. Only then did she turn back to her kiln, its fire now roaring steady and hot, and press her palm once more against the warm brick. And this time when tears came, they were not entirely tears of grief. Benjamin Boone rode the ridge trail back toward his trapline with his chest full of something he had not felt in 6 years, something that made the cold mountain air feel less like a burden and more like a companion. He told himself it was nothing, that he had simply done a kindness for a widow woman who needed help, the same as he'd have done for any soul in trouble he came across in these hard mountains. But when he closed his eyes that night in his lined shack, it was not the memory of Sarah's face that came to him, as it had every night for 6 long years, but the sight of Edith Turner's eyes catching the firelight, steady and grateful, and something else besides, something that looked almost like hope. He came down off the mountain again 11 days later, later than he intended, delayed by a hard snow that closed the high passes for the better part of a week. And when he finally rode into Edith's yard in the gray light before dawn, his heart was beating faster than the ride alone could account for. He found her kiln fire burning strong, banked properly through the night just as he had shown her, and he found Edith herself already awake, sitting on the step of her cabin wrapped in a wool shawl, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands as though she had been expecting him, though of course she could not have known which morning he would return. "You came back," she said, and there was no hiding the pleasure in her voice. "Said I would," Benjamin answered, swinging down from his mule with the ease of a man twice his apparent lightness despite his considerable bulk. "Kiln's holding heat, I see." "Better than it ever did," Edith said, rising to meet him, and she held out a second cup of coffee she had poured before he arrived, as though some part of her had known. "I fired a whole batch of stoneware 3 days back. Cleanest firing I've managed since John passed." Benjamin took the cup, and their fingers brushed for just a moment in the exchange, and something electric passed between them that neither one acknowledged aloud, though both felt the color rise in their faces. "I'm glad of it," he said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. "Man likes to know his work holds up." They sat together on the step as the sun climbed over the ridge, drinking coffee in a silence that felt easy rather than awkward, and Edith found herself stealing glances at him, at the way the morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, at the scar that ran along his jaw just above the beard line, at the enormous, capable hands wrapped around the tin cup like it was made of nothing at all. She wondered what those hands would feel like against her own skin, and then flushed hot with shame at the thought, because it had not even been a year since John's passing, and here she was thinking such things about a stranger, a mountain man she had known less than 2 weeks all told. "You're quiet," Benjamin observed, glancing at her sideways. "Just thinking," Edith said, and did not elaborate. He did not press her, and she found she liked that about him too, the way he seemed content to let silences stretch without needing to fill them. The way he watched the mountains with the patient attention of a man who had learned long ago that the wilderness did not reward those who rushed. "Tell me about your husband," Benjamin said after a while, and the question surprised her coming from him. "John Turner," Edith said, and found that saying his name aloud did not hurt quite as sharply as it once had. "He was a potter back in Ohio before we came west, learned the trade from his father same as his father learned it from his. We came out here because he heard the clay along Willow Creek was some of the finest in the territory, red and fine-grained, perfect for stoneware. He built that kiln with his own hands the first summer we were here, hauled every brick up from the creek bed himself." She paused, turning her cup slowly between her palms. "He was a gentle man. Not built like you," and here she could not help a small smile, "but gentle and patient, and he loved this land more than I think I ever understood until after he was gone and I had to decide whether to stay or go back east." "You stayed," Benjamin said. "I stayed. Partly because I couldn't afford the passage back, if I'm honest, but mostly because leaving felt like losing him twice." She looked up at Benjamin then, meeting his dark eyes directly. "Does that make sense to you?" "More sense than you know," Benjamin said quietly. "I've thought about leaving these mountains more times than I could count, especially in the hard winters when the snow piles up past a man's window and the loneliness gets to gnawing at his bones. But I stay, because somewhere along the way this became the only home I've got, even if it's a lonely one." Edith reached out then, an impulse she did not fully understand, and laid her hand briefly atop his where it rested on his knee. "Maybe it doesn't have to stay lonely," she said, and then, flustered by her own boldness, pulled her hand back and busied herself with her coffee cup. Benjamin said nothing for a long moment, but when Edith risked a glance at him she saw that his jaw had tightened, and his eyes had gone bright with something that looked almost like pain, though of a sweeter kind than grief. "Edith Turner," he said finally, testing her name in his mouth like he was trying the weight of it. "I think I best be getting back up the mountain before I say something I've got no right saying yet." "What sort of something?" she asked, and could not keep the smile from her voice. "The sort of something a man doesn't say to a widow not even a year gone from her husband's grave," Benjamin said, rising to his feet and setting the coffee cup carefully on the step. "But I'll say this much. I'll be back down off that mountain inside 2 weeks, sooner if the weather allows, and I'd take it kindly if you'd let me sit on this step with you again when I do." "I'd take it kindly too," Edith said, standing to see him off, and when he mounted his mule and turned to look back at her one last time before riding out, she raised her hand in a wave that felt like a promise, though neither of them had spoken one aloud. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them named, but both of them cherished. Benjamin came down from the high country every 10 days or so, sometimes bearing furs to trade at the mercantile, sometimes simply finding reason to pass through Willow Creek on his way to nowhere in particular, and each time he stopped first at Edith's cabin before he did anything else, checking the kiln, checking on her, staying an hour or an afternoon depending on what work needed doing and how much daylight remained. He mended her fence when a section blew down in a windstorm, using his considerable strength to set new posts deep into the rocky ground without complaint. He hauled firewood for her from the stand of aspens up the hill, more than she could have managed alone in a month of trying, stacking it neat against the side of her cabin in a pile that made her laugh at its size when she first saw it. He taught her, patiently and without ever making her feel foolish for not already knowing, the proper way to bank a kiln fire so it would hold through a full night without tending, the way to read the color of the flames through the peephole to know when the stoneware had reached its proper heat. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them could have named the exact moment it happened, they fell in love. It happened in small moments, the way real love tends to happen rather than the sudden thunderclap of storybooks. It happened when Edith caught Benjamin laughing at something she said, a full, deep laugh that transformed his weathered face and made her heart do something strange and fluttering in her chest. It happened when Benjamin watched her hands work the potter's wheel one afternoon, shaping a bowl from a lump of raw clay with a skill and grace that struck him as its own kind of art, and found he could not look away from the sight of her, absorbed and steady and entirely herself. It happened on a cold evening in late November when Benjamin arrived later than usual, after dark, having pushed through a light snow to reach her cabin, and Edith opened her door to find him standing there dusted white with flakes, his beard frosted, his enormous frame somehow both intimidating and achingly welcome, silhouetted against the falling snow. "You shouldn't have ridden through that," she scolded, pulling him inside by the sleeve before she had quite thought about the impropriety of it. A woman alone pulling a man into her cabin after dark. "You could have waited for morning." "Could have," Benjamin agreed, stamping the snow from his boots on her threshold. "But I got to worrying about your fire holding through a storm like this, and I couldn't rightly settle until I knew you were warm." Edith felt something crack open in her chest at those words, some last wall she had been holding up against the possibility of loving again, and before she quite knew what she was doing she had crossed the small distance of her cabin floor and pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him even through his snow-dusted coat. "Benjamin," she said, and her voice came out breathless, uncertain. "I think I've fallen in love with you, and I don't rightly know what to do about it. Seeing as I buried my husband less than a year past, and here I am with my hand on a mountain man's chest like some kind of forward woman." Benjamin's hand came up to cover hers where it rested against him, and his dark eyes, catching the lamplight, had gone soft and fierce all at once. "There's no shame in a heart healing, Edith. God knows I fought against loving again for 6 long years, told myself the mountains were enough, told myself I owed it to Sarah's memory to stay closed off. But you went and rebuilt something in me the same night I rebuilt that kiln, and I don't think either one of us can put the fire back out now even if we wanted to." "I don't want to," Edith whispered. "Neither do I," Benjamin said, and then, with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man built like a mountain himself, he cupped her face in one enormous calloused hand and kissed her, softly at first and then with growing certainty, and Edith felt the last of her grief loosen its grip on her heart, not disappearing entirely. John would always hold a piece of her, but making room at last for something new to grow alongside it. They stayed up that whole snowy night talking before the hearth fire, learning the shapes of each other's lives in earnest now that the truth between them had been spoken aloud. Benjamin told her about growing up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, the youngest of 7 children, how he had left home at 17 to find work on the riverboats before the war took his older brothers, and left the farm too broken to return to. He told her about Sarah properly this time, not just the fact of her death but the shape of her, how she used to sing while she worked, how her laugh had sounded like water over stones, and Edith listened without jealousy, understanding that a man who could love that deeply once was a man capable of loving deeply again, and that his grief for Sarah did not diminish what he now felt for her. Edith in turn told him about her own childhood in Ohio, about meeting John at a church social when she was 19, about the slow, steady courtship that had led to marriage, and then, 3 years later, the long journey west that had brought them to Willow Creek and the clay banks that would become both John's craft and his grave marker, for she had fired his headstone herself from the same red clay he had loved, a simple slab marked with his name and the years of his life. Standing now in the small cemetery behind the church. "I'll want to visit his grave," Benjamin said when she told him this. "Pay my respects to the man who loved you first if you'll allow it." The offer moved Edith so deeply she had to look away for a moment to compose herself. "I'd like that very much," she managed finally. "I think John would have liked you, strange as that is to say. He always said this valley needed more good men in it." The snow stopped sometime before dawn, and Benjamin insisted on sleeping in the small barn rather than presume further on her hospitality, though not before promising to return properly, with intentions declared, Once a suitable interval had passed, and he had spoken to the minister about what courting a widow required by way of decency and custom in a town like Willow Creek. That winter passed in a warmth that had nothing to do with the season, though the season itself proved a hard one, with snow piling deep against the cabin walls and temperatures plunging low enough that Edith worried constantly for Benjamin's safety on his solitary trapline up past Elkhorn Pass. He came down to see her whenever weather allowed, sometimes staying only an hour before the failing light forced him back up the mountain, sometimes staying 2 or 3 days when a storm made the return trip too dangerous, sleeping always in the barn out of respect for her reputation in a town where gossip traveled faster than any horse. The town noticed, of course. Willow Creek was too small for a courtship to remain private for long, and soon enough the women at the church social were whispering behind their fans about the widow Turner and her mountain man, some with warmth and understanding, others with the particular cruelty that small towns reserve for anyone who dares to find happiness on a timeline the gossips consider improper. Mrs. Abigail Whitfield, the minister's wife and self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek's moral character, cornered Edith after Sunday service in early December, her thin face pinched with disapproval. "It's not been a full year, Edith," Mrs. Whitfield said, in the tone of a woman delivering an important scriptural truth. "Folks are talking about that trapper coming round your place at all hours. What would poor John think?" Edith felt her spine straighten, felt something of John's own quiet steel rise up in her at the mention of his name being used as a weapon against her happiness. "I believe John would think I deserve to be warm and cared for, Mrs. Whitfield, same as any soul deserves in this life. And I'll thank you to let me grieve and heal in whatever order my own heart requires, rather than the order your calendar prefers." The older woman's mouth pursed into a tight line, but something in Edith's steady gaze seemed to give her pause, and she said nothing further, though the whispers continued in Edith's absence, as whispers always do. Benjamin heard of the talk eventually, from the mercantile owner who traded fairly with him and had no patience for gossip himself, and he arrived at Edith's cabin that evening with a set to his jaw that told her something weighed on him. "I heard what Mrs. Whitfield said to you," he told her, once they were settled before the fire. "I'll not have you shamed on my account, Edith. If my coming round is causing you trouble in this town, I can space my visits further apart, wait the proper time, whatever you think is right." Edith reached across the small distance between them and took his enormous hand in both of hers. "Benjamin Boone, I have buried a husband and rebuilt a kiln and kept myself fed and sheltered through a Colorado winter with my own 2 hands. I am not afraid of Mrs. Whitfield's opinions, and I will not have you stay away from me on account of small-minded talk. You rebuilt more than my kiln fire that first night. You rebuilt something in me I thought had gone out for good. I won't apologize for wanting that warmth, and I won't ask you to ration it out on some calendar that has nothing to do with what's true between us." Something fierce and grateful moved across Benjamin's face at her words, and he pulled her hand up to press a kiss against her knuckles, rough beard scratching pleasantly against her skin. "Then I'll keep coming, and let the gossips say what they please. A man doesn't find something like this twice in one life if he's lucky, and I've already lost it once. I won't lose it again to fear of what small people might say." Word of their courtship reached even the far edges of the county by January, and it was not all cruelty that came with the attention. Old Ezra Winslow, who ran the livery and had known John Turner well, stopped Benjamin on the road one afternoon to shake his hand and tell him plainly that John would have wanted his widow cared for by a good man, and that anyone with eyes could see Benjamin Boone qualified as such. The minister himself, once he had spoken privately with both Edith and Benjamin about their intentions, and satisfied himself that their courtship proceeded with proper decency, offered his blessing, and told Mrs. Whitfield in no uncertain terms to mind her own affairs going forward. By February, with the worst of the winter storms behind them and the days beginning their slow lengthening toward spring, Benjamin made a decision that had been building in him for weeks. He rode down from the mountain on a clear, cold morning. The sky above Willow Creek scrubbed blue and cloudless, and instead of dismounting at Edith's cabin as was his custom, he continued into town first, tying his mule outside the mercantile and disappearing inside for the better part of an hour. When he finally arrived at Edith's yard, she was bent over her wheel, shaping a tall vase from a mound of red clay, her hands and forearms streaked with the stuff, a smudge of it even on her cheek where she had brushed back a loose strand of hair. She looked up at the sound of his approach and smiled, that warm, easy smile that had become as familiar to him now as the mountains themselves. "You're early," she said. "Didn't expect you until tomorrow at the soonest." "Had business in town needed tending," Benjamin said, and something in his voice made her still her hands on the wheel and look at him more closely. He dismounted and crossed to her, and she saw now that his hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in a scrap of soft leather. "Edith Turner," he said, and dropped to one knee in the mud and clay dust of her yard without any apparent concern for his trousers. "I have loved you since the night I rebuilt your kiln fire, though I didn't have the sense to name it as love until later, and I have loved you more every day since, watching you shape beauty out of raw earth same as you shape something new out of my own broken heart. I've got no grand fortune to offer you, only a trapline, a mule, and a cabin up past Elkhorn Pass that could use a woman's touch, but I've got a whole heart, and it's yours if you'll have it. Will you marry me?" He unwrapped the leather to reveal a ring, simple and plainly made, a band of gold that he had clearly fashioned by the blacksmith in town that very morning, set with a small polished stone, the deep red-brown color of the very clay staining her hands. Edith stared at the ring, then at Benjamin's face, upturned toward her with an expression of such naked hope and vulnerability that it took her breath entirely away, and she found she could not speak for the tightness in her throat. "That's clay stone," she managed finally. "You had him set a piece of fired clay into a ring." "Thought it fitting," Benjamin said, and a nervous smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Seeing as clay's what brought us together in the first place, figured you should wear a piece of it close to your heart, same as I aim to be close to it for the rest of my days if you'll let me." "Yes," Edith said before he could say another word, pulling him up from his knee with both clay-stained hands so she could throw her arms around his neck properly. "Yes, Benjamin Boone, 1,000 times yes." He lifted her clean off the ground in his embrace, spinning her once in the cold February sunlight while she laughed against his shoulder, and when he set her down again, he kissed her long and thorough, uncaring that any passer-by on the road might see, uncaring of anything at all except the woman in his arms who had somehow, against all the loneliness of 6 hard mountain years, found her way into the very center of his heart. They were married in April, once the mountain passes had cleared enough for Benjamin's few scattered friends among the trappers and mountain men to make the journey down for the ceremony, and once the last frost had passed so the wildflowers could bloom properly along Willow Creek for the occasion. The minister performed the ceremony in the small church, with Mrs. Whitfield in a surprising turn, having softened enough over the intervening months to help arrange flowers for the altar. Her earlier disapproval melted away by the evident devotion between the couple and perhaps, Edith suspected, by her husband the minister's gentle insistence that judgment was not a virtue the Lord particularly favored. Edith wore a simple dress of pale blue, sewn by her own hands from fabric purchased at the mercantile, and she carried a small bouquet of early wildflowers gathered from the meadow above her cabin. Benjamin, cleaned up and wearing a proper coat borrowed from Ezra Winslow that strained considerably across his massive shoulders, looked so uncomfortable in his formal attire, and so radiantly happy at the same time that half the women in attendance found themselves dabbing at their eyes before the vows were even spoken. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Benjamin kissed his new bride with a tenderness that belied his enormous strength, and the small congregation erupted into applause and cheerful shouting in the way frontier weddings tended to, without much regard for the solemnity a city church might have demanded. They held the wedding supper outside Edith's cabin, tables set up in the yard beside the kiln that had brought them together, laden with food brought by half the town, roasted venison that Benjamin himself had shot the week before, fresh bread, dried apple pies, and enough coffee to float a riverboat. Old Ezra Winslow made a toast that had half the guests laughing and the other half wiping tears, recalling how John Turner had once told him, back when he first built that very kiln, that a good fire was the difference between raw clay and something that could hold water, hold warmth, hold a home together. "Seems fitting," Ezra said, raising his cup, "that it was a fire that brought these two together, and I reckon there's not a soul here doubts the flame between them will hold steady a good long while." Edith found Benjamin's hand under the table during the toast and squeezed it, and when she glanced up at him, she saw that his eyes had gone bright and damp, moved beyond words by the mention of John and by the warmth of a town that had, in the end, welcomed him fully into its fold. That night, after the last guests had departed and the fires had burned down to embers, Benjamin carried his new wife across the threshold of her cabin, now their cabin, both of them laughing at the awkwardness of his considerable size managing the narrow doorway. And the love they made that night was tender and fierce in equal measure, the coming together of two people who had each known the particular ache of losing someone and had found, against all expectation, that the heart possessed room enough to love again, fully and completely, without betraying the memory of what came before. They settled into married life with the practical ease of two people who had already spent months learning each other's rhythms before ever standing before the minister. Benjamin gave up much of his solitary trapping to build a proper addition onto Edith's cabin, wide enough to house them both comfortably and eventually, they both hoped, a family. He still made trips up to the high country to check his remaining trapline and to visit the mountains that had sheltered him through his loneliest years, but he never stayed away more than a few days at a time now, always drawn back down to the valley, and the woman and the kiln fire waiting for him there. Edith's pottery business flourished that spring and summer in ways it never had while she worked alone, with Benjamin's strength to haul clay and wood, and his patient attention to the kiln fires that had once been her greatest struggle. She found herself producing finer work than ever before, and word of the Turner Boone stoneware, as folks in town had taken to calling it, spread beyond Willow Creek to the growing towns along the Front Range. The Denver buyer who came through each season began placing larger orders, and by midsummer Edith had to hire a young girl from town, Mary Alderson, to help with the simpler tasks of preparing clay and glazing so she could keep pace with demand. Benjamin, for his part, found in the pottery work and the settled life of the valley something he had not realized he was missing during his years alone on the mountain. He took to building a proper workshop beside the kiln, wide enough for a second wheel so that Edith could teach him the basics of throwing clay, though his enormous hands, so capable with an axe or a rifle, proved comically clumsy at first with the delicate work of shaping a bowl. "You're squeezing it like you mean to strangle it," Edith told him one afternoon in early summer, laughing as his third attempt at a simple cup collapsed into a shapeless lump under too much pressure from his powerful hands. "Clay wants gentleness, Benjamin, same as everything else worth shaping." "Easier said than done, wife, when a man spent his whole life learning to grip things hard enough not to lose them," Benjamin said, though he was laughing too, wiping clay from his beard where it had splattered when the cup gave way. "Then learn a new kind of grip," Edith said, coming around behind him to guide his hands with her own, showing him the light, steady pressure the wheel required. And something in the lesson felt larger than pottery, felt like a metaphor for the whole shape of their marriage. This enormous strong man learning, patiently and with good humor, to hold something precious without crushing it, to be gentle with what he loved most. By late summer, Edith found herself increasingly tired in the mornings, and it was Mary Alderson, sharp-eyed despite her youth, who first suggested the reason might be one Edith had not yet considered. When the truth was confirmed by the traveling doctor who came through Willow Creek that August, Edith could hardly wait for Benjamin to return from his latest trip up to check the trapline, and when he rode into the yard that evening, she ran out to meet him before he had even fully dismounted. "Benjamin," she said, breathless with the news she had been holding all day, "I'm carrying our child." For a moment Benjamin simply stared at her, and Edith worried briefly that she had somehow said the wrong thing. But then his face broke open into an expression of such pure joy that she felt tears spring to her own eyes in response. He swept her up into his arms with a whoop that likely carried clear to the next homestead over, spinning her carefully, mindful now of precious cargo, before setting her down and pressing his enormous palm gently against her still flat belly with an expression of wondering tenderness. "A child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Edith, I never thought after Sarah, after all those lonely years, I never thought I'd have this. A wife, a home, and now a child besides." "Believe it," Edith said, laughing through her own tears. "Because it's happening, Benjamin Boone, and you'd best start practicing your gentle grip on more than just clay, because come next spring you'll have a baby to hold." The pregnancy proceeded through the autumn and winter without serious complication, though Benjamin fussed over Edith with a tenderness that occasionally exasperated her, insisting she rest more than she felt necessary, taking over the heaviest tasks around the pottery himself, even as his own trapline work fell increasingly by the wayside. He built a cradle that winter from aspen wood, carving it with a careful attention that surprised even himself, decorating the headboard with a simple pattern of mountain peaks that he said reminded him of the view from his old line shack, a fitting tribute to the wilderness that had shaped him before Edith had shaped him further still. Their son, whom they named John Benjamin Boone in honor of both the husband Edith had lost and the man who now stood beside her, was born on a clear morning in early April, nearly a full year to the day after Benjamin had first knelt in the mud of her yard to propose. The birth was attended by the same traveling doctor, along with several of the women from town who had, over the intervening year, become genuine friends to Edith rather than mere gossiping neighbors, their earlier judgment long since dissolved by witnessing the evident goodness of the marriage and the obvious devotion between husband and wife. Benjamin, banished from the birthing room by the doctor's firm instruction, paced the yard outside for the better part of 6 hours, wearing a visible path in the dirt beside his beloved kiln, until finally the cry of a newborn infant cut through the morning air, and one of the women appeared at the door to summon him inside. He found Edith propped up in their bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle against her chest, and when he approached, hardly daring to breathe for fear of disturbing the fragile scene, she looked up at him with an expression of such complete love that his own eyes filled immediately with tears. "Come meet your son," she said softly, and Benjamin crossed the room with careful, quiet steps despite his considerable size, and when Edith placed the infant into his enormous arms, so small against the breadth of his chest, something in Benjamin Boone that had remained guarded even through the joy of the wedding, even through the months of settled married happiness, finally and completely surrendered to the fullness of this new life. "He's got your eyes," Benjamin said wonderingly, gazing down at the tiny face, already searching the world with a newborn's unfocused curiosity. "And your stubborn chin, I'd wager, though it's too soon to tell for certain," Edith said, laughing softly despite her exhaustion. "Whatever he's got, he's ours," Benjamin said, and pressed a kiss first to his son's small forehead, then to his wife's tired brow. "And I promise you both, same as I promised the day I asked you to marry me, that I'll keep this family's fire burning warm and steady for as long as I've got breath in my body to tend it." The years that followed brought their share of hardships, as any life on the frontier inevitably did. There was the summer of the Great Drought, 2 years after young John's birth, when the creek ran so low that Edith worried for the clay pit itself, and Benjamin spent weeks hauling water from a spring higher up the mountain to keep both the pottery and their small garden alive. There was the harsh winter when young John came down with a fever that frightened them both terribly, memories of the fever that had taken John Turner and Sarah both rising unwelcome in their minds, until the crisis broke after 3 sleepless nights and the boy's fever finally cooled, leaving his parents weak with relief and gratitude in equal measure. But there was joy too, abundant and steady, growing alongside the hardships the way wildflowers grew stubborn and bright even in Rocky Mountain soil. 2 years after John Benjamin's birth, Edith gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Grace, in honor of the woman Benjamin had loved and lost before Edith ever came into his life, a gesture that moved Benjamin so deeply he could not speak for several minutes after Edith first suggested the name, only holding his wife's hand and nodding, unable to trust his voice. 2 years after that came a second son, Thomas, named for Edith's own father back in Ohio, a boy who from his earliest years showed a fascination with his father's rifle and traps that suggested he might follow Benjamin into the mountains one day, while young John, the eldest, had inherited his mother's steady hands and patient eye, already at 8 years old showing real promise at the potter's wheel his mother had taught him to use. The pottery business, meanwhile, had grown from Edith's small, solitary operation into something considerably larger, with a second kiln built alongside the first, and Mary Alderson, now grown into a capable young woman herself, managing much of the daily production alongside 2 other hired hands from town. The Turner Boone stoneware had gained enough reputation that pieces were shipped as far as Denver, and even, on occasion, back east to buyers who had heard of the fine red clay work coming out of the Colorado mountains. Benjamin never entirely gave up his connection to the wilderness that had shaped him, though his trapping days grew fewer as his family, and the pottery business demanded more of his time. He still made occasional trips up to the high country, sometimes bringing young John or Thomas along as they grew old enough to learn something of the mountain skills that had once been his entire livelihood, teaching them to read animal tracks in fresh snow, to build a proper fire in wet conditions, to respect the wilderness without fearing it. On the 10th anniversary of that first cold October morning, when Benjamin had found Edith's kiln gone cold and stayed through the night to rebuild it, the two of them stood together beside that same kiln, now old and weathered but still functioning as reliably as ever, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple above them while their 3 children played in the yard nearby, John now 18 and nearly as tall as his father, Sarah Grace 16 and already courting a young man from town with her parents' cautious blessing, and Thomas at 14, already showing signs of the same restless love for the mountains that had once sent his father into solitary exile among the peaks. 10 years, Edith said softly, leaning back against Benjamin's broad chest as his arms came around her from behind, a familiar and beloved embrace after a decade of marriage. I still remember how frightened I was, finding you standing in my yard that morning, this enormous stranger with a rifle and a mule. I still remember how frightened I was of what I felt, watching you kneel beside that cold kiln with tears on your face, Benjamin said, resting his chin atop her head, his beard now more silver than it had been that first morning, but his strength undiminished by the passing years. Took me the better part of that whole winter to admit to myself what you'd already gone and done to my heart before I'd even properly introduced myself. And now look at us, Edith said, gesturing with one hand toward their children, toward the workshop and the second kiln, toward the comfortable home that had grown up around that first small cabin over the years. A whole life built up from one cold fire and one stranger's kindness. Best decision I ever made, stopping in this yard that morning, Benjamin said. "Though I'll confess I didn't think of it as a decision at the time. Felt more like something pulling me here, something I couldn't have resisted even if I'd tried." "I like to think John would be glad of it," Edith said, more quietly now, and Benjamin's arms tightened around her in acknowledgement of the truth in that, the way grief and gratitude could exist together in a person's heart without contradiction. "He always said this valley needed good men. I think he'd be glad to know one found his way here, even if it took losing him first for it to happen." "I visit his grave every month still," Benjamin said. "Have done for 10 years now. Feels right somehow, keeping that connection, letting him know his wife and his kiln both ended up in good hands." "You've done more than keep them in good hands," Edith said, turning in his embrace to look up at him properly, her eyes bright with the particular contentment of a woman who had built, alongside great sorrow, an equally great and lasting happiness. "You gave me back my life, Benjamin Boone, same as you rebuilt that kiln fire all those years ago. Every warm thing in my life since that morning traces back to you." "And every warm thing in mine traces back to you," Benjamin said, and kissed her softly as the sun continued its descent behind the mountains that had once been his only home and now stood simply as the beautiful backdrop to a life he had built with the woman he loved. 6 years alone on that mountain, Edith. 6 years of thinking I'd used up whatever capacity I had for loving someone that deeply. And then I saw your kiln smoke had stopped rising, and something in me knew, before I even understood what I was walking toward, that stopping to check on you would change the whole shape of my life." "It changed the shape of mine too," Edith murmured against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound that had become as familiar and beloved to her as her own pulse over the years of their marriage. "Every good thing that came after started with you noticing that fire had gone cold." They stood together like that as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had each known profound loss and had found in each other, not a replacement for what they had lost but something new entirely. A love built slowly and deliberately from shared grief, transformed into shared joy. From a cold kiln rebuilt into a warmth that had lasted a decade, and showed every sign of lasting decades more. Their children's laughter drifted across the yard as the first stars appeared above the mountain peaks. And inside their home, the fire in the hearth burned steady and warm, tended now not out of desperate necessity, as it once had been, but out of the settled contentment of a family secure in its love for one another. The kiln beside them, that same kiln John Turner had built with his own hands and Benjamin Boone had rebuilt in the dark hours before dawn, still stood as testament to the way love could grow from the most unexpected beginnings. How a stranger's kindness on one cold October morning could kindle a fire that would burn, steady and warm and everlasting, for the whole rest of 2 lives joined together against all the loneliness the wild mountains could offer and win. In the years that followed that 10th anniversary, the Boone family continued to grow and prosper in Willow Creek, their pottery becoming known throughout the territory as some of the finest stoneware west of the Mississippi. John Benjamin Boone, the eldest son, eventually took over management of the kilns alongside his mother, marrying a local girl named Charlotte and raising 3 children of his own in a house built just up the hill from his parents' original cabin. Sarah Grace married her young suitor, a rancher's son named William Hartley, and moved to a spread some miles distant, though she visited often enough that her mother never felt the distance too keenly. Thomas, true to his early inclinations, spent several years learning trapping and mountain craft from his father, before eventually settling into a position as a guide for surveying parties mapping the territory's mineral resources, work that let him keep one foot always in the wilderness he loved, while still returning regularly to the family he cherished equally. Edith Turner Boone lived to see her 70th year, still occasionally working a potter's wheel even in her later years, her hands slower but no less skilled than they had been in her youth. Benjamin Boone, despite the hard life of a mountain man in his younger years, lived on into his own old age beside her. His once powerful frame gradually softened by time, but his devotion to his wife undimmed by even a single day of their long marriage. They were buried, when their time finally came within a few years of each other, in the small cemetery behind the Willow Creek Church, their graves marked with headstones fashioned from the very clay that had brought them together, standing now beside the grave of John Turner, the three of them resting together in the valley they had all, in their own ways and their own times, called home. The kiln itself stood for decades after, tended by successive generations of the Boone family, a physical monument to the night. A lonely mountain man had noticed a widow's fire gone cold and could not rest until he had rebuilt it, warming not just clay and stone but two broken hearts that found, in each other's company, a warmth that would last the whole rest of their lives and beyond, passed down through children and grandchildren who grew up hearing the story of how their family began. With a cold kiln, a mountain man's kindness, and a fire that never truly went out again,